You think safety is found behind a 6-inch steel door? Cassian Virelli did. The moment the first alarm cut through the silence of the Virelli estate, Cassian didn't offer a choice, he offered a command. He gripped Elara's shoulder, his jaw tight with a cold, calculated fury, and forced her behind the safe room's reinforced threshold. For Cassian, love was a liability, a weakness Draven Kallor was currently exploiting with a hail of gunfire in the foyer. When he turned the electronic lock with a final, echoing beep, he thought he'd secured his world. He didn't see the calm, defiant fire in Elara's eyes. He didn't hear her whispered vow, "I am not your shadow, Cassian." Now, as the mansion falls and the men who fear Cassian's silence begin to retreat, the one door that was never supposed to open clicks. If you're ready to see what happens when a Mafia queen refuses to be a captive, stay until the end. Hit that like button and tell me, would you stay behind the door or step into the fire? The silence of the Virelli estate didn't break all at once. It dissolved in a series of sharp, clinical fractures. First, the distant pop of a perimeter sensor, then the low, rhythmic thud of suppressed rounds striking the reinforced glass of the conservatory. In the master suite, Cassian Virelli didn't flinch. He moved with a terrifying, mechanical grace, already reaching for the obsidian panel hidden behind a silk tapestry. Draven Kallor had finally arrived, and he hadn't come for territory. He had come to prove that even a man of ice has a melting point. "Cassian, look at the monitors," Elara said, her voice a calm blade cutting through the rising din of the alarm. She didn't tremble. She stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the flickering shadows of the garden's emergency lights. "They aren't hitting the vaults. They're moving in a pincer formation toward this wing. This isn't a robbery. It's an execution." Cassian didn't look at the screens. He looked at her. His intense gray eyes were stripped of their usual calculated distance, burning instead with a dark, suffocating possessiveness. To him, the world was a series of variables to be controlled, and Elara was the only one he couldn't afford to lose to chance. "The vaults don't matter," Cassian rasped, his voice a low vibration that seemed to command the very air in the room to still. He crossed the floor in 3 predatory strides, his hand closing over Elara's shoulder. It wasn't a caress, it was a claim. He steered her toward the far wall, where a slab of seamless steel waited to swallow her whole. "Cassian, wait. If I'm in there, I'm blind." Elara resisted, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the frantic, heavy drum of a heart he claimed didn't exist. "I can help you navigate the back corridors. I know the override sequences better than Ronan does." "You're not a strategist tonight, Elara. You're my wife," Cassian replied, his jaw tightening into a mask of iron. He forced her back into the small, cold room, his face leaning into hers until they shared the same jagged breath. This was the moment, the intense, wordless stare that had defined their marriage. It was a look that promised protection, but delivered a cage. He didn't wait for her consent. He reached past her shoulder, his eyes locked onto hers with a recognition that burned through every defense she possessed. With a deliberate, final movement, he pressed the sequence on the inner panel. The safe room door slid shut with a heavy hydraulic hiss, and the electronic lock engaged with a metallic click that echoed like a verdict. Cassian stood on the other side of the steel, his shadow momentarily lingering against the light of the hall. He had secured his most precious asset. He had regained control. But as Elara stood in the absolute silence of the reinforced vault, she didn't feel safe. She felt erased. And as the sounds of the raid intensified outside, she realized that Cassian had made his first and perhaps final tactical error. He thought the door would keep the danger out, but he had forgotten that he was the one leaving her in the dark. The silence inside the safe room was absolute, a heavy, synthetic quiet that felt more suffocating than the smoke beginning to seep through the vents. Elara stood in the center of the reinforced chamber, her eyes fixed on the bank of monitors that lined the western wall. On the screens, the Virelli estate was a mosaic of flickering blue light and sudden, violent bursts of orange. She watched as Cassian's men retreated in a synchronized dance of desperation, and she watched Draven Kallor's shadows slip through the gaps in their defense. Cassian was visible on the primary feed, a silhouette of charcoal silk and lethal intent. He was pinned down in the grand foyer, his movements dictated by the need to stay between the invaders and the hallway leading to this room. He was fighting a war of attrition, sacrificing his men and his territory to protect a door he had already locked. "You're playing his game, Cassian," Elara whispered, her fingers ghosting over the cold steel of the manual override lever. She could see the tactical error unfolding in real time. By locking her away, Cassian had paralyzed his own greatest asset. He was fighting with one eye on the enemy and the other on the safe room, his legendary focus fractured by the weight of his own protection. Ronan appeared on the secondary screen, gesturing frantically for Cassian to fall back, but Cassian remained a statue of defiance, anchored to the spot by a belief that Elara's safety was the only victory that mattered. Elara knew the Virelli code: the king protects the queen at all costs, but as she watched a Kallor operative move into a flanking position Dominic hadn't noticed, she realized the cost was going to be his life. If she stayed behind this door, she wouldn't be a survivor, she would be a widow. Her hand closed around the override lever. There was no protocol for this, no permission had been granted, and no subordinate in the Virelli hierarchy would ever dream of reversing a command from the boss. But Elara wasn't a subordinate. She pulled the lever. The hydraulic hiss was a scream in the silence of the vault. The electronic lock chirped a protest, a high-pitched sound that cut through the distant roar of gunfire. As the heavy steel slab began to retract, Elara felt the first rush of real air, acrid, hot, and tasting of gunpowder. She didn't hesitate. She stepped through the threshold, her heels clicking against the marble with a deliberate, steady rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat she had felt in Cassian's chest moments before. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows and flashing emergency lights. At the end of it, Cassian spun around, his weapon raised, his eyes wide with a rare, jagged flash of shock. He looked at the open door, then at the woman standing in the center of the corridor, her face calm and her eyes fixed on the threat he hadn't seen yet. The door was open, the rules were shattered, and for the first time in Cassian's life, the Mafia boss realized he wasn't the only one in control. The raid was still raging, but the power had already shifted. The hydraulic hiss was a scream in the silence of the vault, a sound that signaled the end of Cassian's absolute rule. As the heavy steel slab began to retract, Elara stepped through the threshold, her heels clicking against the marble with a deliberate, steady rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat she had felt in Cassian's chest moments before. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows and flashing emergency lights. At the end of it, Cassian spun around, his weapon raised, his eyes wide with a rare, jagged flash of shock. He looked at the open door, then at the woman standing in the center of the corridor, her face calm and her eyes fixed on the threat he hadn't seen yet. The door was open, the rules were shattered, and for the first time in Cassian's life, the Mafia boss realized he wasn't the only one in control. The raid was still raging, but the power had already shifted. The hydraulic hiss was a scream in the silence of the vault, a sound that signaled the end of Cassian's absolute rule. As the heavy steel slab began to retract, Elara stepped through the threshold, her heels clicking against the marble with a deliberate, steady rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat she had felt in Cassian's chest moments before. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows and flashing emergency lights. At the end of it, Cassian spun around, his weapon raised, his eyes wide with a rare, jagged flash of shock. He looked at the open door, then at the woman standing in the center of the corridor, her face calm and her eyes fixed on the threat he hadn't seen yet. The door was open, the rules were shattered, and for the first time in Cassian's life, the Mafia boss realized he wasn't the only one in control. The raid was still raging, but the power had already shifted. The hydraulic hiss was a scream in the silence of the vault, a sound that signaled the end of Cassian's absolute rule. As the heavy steel slab began to retract, Elara stepped through the threshold, her heels clicking against the marble with a deliberate, steady rhythm that mirrored the heartbeat she had felt in Cassian's chest moments before. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows and flashing emergency lights. At the end of it, Cassian spun around, his weapon raised, his eyes wide with a rare, jagged flash of shock. He looked at the open door, then at the woman standing in the center of the corridor, her face calm and her eyes fixed on the threat he hadn't seen yet. The door was open, the rules were shattered, and for the first time in his life, the Mafia boss realized he wasn't the only one in control. The raid was still raging, but the power had already shifted. The hydraulic hiss was a scream in the silence of the vault, a sound that signaled the end of Cassian's absolute rule. As the heavy steel slab retracted, Elara stepped through the threshold, her silhouette framed by the flickering emergency lights of the corridor. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and spent brass, a sharp contrast to the sterile, filtered oxygen of her cage. She didn't look for a weapon, she looked for the man who thought he could win this war by making her a ghost. At the far end of the hallway, Cassian spun. His weapon was up, his body a coiled of lethal instinct, but the moment he saw her, the Ice King shattered. For the first time in his life, his discipline failed him. His aim wavered, his finger frozen on the trigger as his brain struggled to reconcile the locked door behind him with the woman standing before him. "Elara, what are you doing?" he rasped, the words forced through a throat tight with a terror he had never admitted to possessing. "Get back inside, now!" He moved toward her, his boots crunching on the glass shards of a shattered sconce. Even in the middle of a raid, his first instinct was to physically force the world back into the order he had decreed. But Elara didn't flinch. She met his intense, gray-eyed stare with a quiet ferocity that stopped him in his tracks. "You're focused on the wrong threat, Cassian," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the chaos. She pointed to the tablet she had pulled from the safe room's wall, a direct line into the estate's auxiliary sensors. "Draven isn't trying to break into the foyer. He's already in the ventilation shafts of the lower levels. While you're standing here guarding an empty room, he's cutting off your oxygen and your exit." Cassian looked at the screen, then back at his wife. The realization hit him like a physical blow. By obsessing over her safety, he had allowed Draven to dictate the terms of the engagement. He had been so busy playing the protector that he had forgotten to be the strategist. "I locked that door," he whispered, a strange mix of fury and awe coloring his tone. "And I opened it," Elara replied, stepping into his space until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. She reached up, her fingers grazing the line of his jaw, forcing him to see her, not as a liability, but as the only person in the building who wasn't blinded by his orders. "I am a Virelli, and if we're going to survive Draven Kallor, you need to start treating me like one." The sound of an explosion rocked the floor beneath them, but Cassian didn't look away. The control he had craved was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a partnership. He reached out, his hand settling at the nape of her neck, and for the first time he didn't command, he nodded. The rules of the underworld had just been rewritten, and as they turned together to face the shadows of the estate, the king finally accepted his queen. The silence inside the safe room was not a sanctuary, it was a tomb of filtered air and synthetic light. Elara stood before the digital interface, her eyes tracking the thermal signatures on the screen as they swarmed the grand staircase. Cassian was a lone, brilliant pulse of heat at the center of the storm, his movements becoming increasingly erratic as he divided his focus between the gunman in front of him and the steel door behind him. He was a master of war being unmade by his own fear of losing her. "You're going to get yourself killed trying to be my hero, Cassian," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation. To the rest of the world, Elara was the quiet elegance at Cassian Virelli's side, the woman who had married into a legacy of blood and iron. They didn't know that she had spent her nights memorizing the estate's blueprints while Cassian slept, or that she had reverse-engineered the house's security protocols as a game of mental chess. Cassian believed he had locked her away with a code only he possessed, but he had underestimated the woman he had spent 5 years trying to protect. Her fingers danced over the keypad with a surgical precision. She didn't use the primary override. That would alert the main terminal and signal her location to the invaders. Instead, she accessed a dormant maintenance loop she had discovered months ago, a ghost in the machine that Cassian's disciplined mind had overlooked. The air in the room seemed to thin as the final digit was entered. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the hydraulic system groaned, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floorboards. The electronic lock chirped once, a sharp, clear note of defiance, and the heavy steel slab began to retract. The click of the door opening felt like a physical blow to the power dynamic that had defined their marriage. It was the sound of a subordinate becoming a partner, of a captive becoming a participant. As the door slid into the wall, the acrid scent of gunpowder and smoke rushed in to meet her. Elara stepped through the threshold, her silhouette framed by the stark light of the vault, and looked down the long corridor. At the far end, Cassian spun around, his weapon raised in a reflex of pure lethality. The shock that registered on his face was visceral, a jagged crack in his iron-clad composure. His grey eyes, usually so controlled, were wide with a mixture of fury and a terrifying sudden awe. He had expected to find her huddled in the dark, waiting for his permission to breathe. Instead, she found her standing in the wreckage of his command, her face calm and her eyes fixed on the shadows behind him. The door was open, the lock was broken, and as Elara stepped into the fire, she finally saw the man she loved begin to truly see her. The grand foyer was a cathedral of violence, the air thick with the chalky dust of pulverized marble and the sharp copper tang of blood. Cassian was crouched behind a fallen gueridon table, his silhouette a jagged line of charcoal and grit as he exchanged fire with the shadows lurking in the mezzanine. Every time he moved, he checked the hallway behind him, a fatal habit born from a protector's instinct that Draven Kallor was already beginning to exploit. "You're losing, Cassian," Draven voice echoed from the upper balcony, smooth and terrifyingly patient. "Every minute you spend guarding that door is a minute my men spend dismantling your life. Give her to me, and I might leave you enough of an empire to bury your pride in." Cassian's response was a precise burst of gunfire that chipped the gold leaf off the railing where Draven stood, but his jaw was set in a mask of desperation. He was out of time, and he knew it. Then the clicking of heels, steady, rhythmic and impossibly calm, cut through the din of the reload. Elara stepped into the foyer, her white silk blouse a startling beacon against the scorched walls. The shooting didn't stop because of a ceasefire. It stopped because the sight was so improbable that even Kallor's mercenaries hesitated. Cassian lunged toward her, his face contorted in a rare, vocal panic. "Elara, get down! What are you doing?" She didn't drop. She didn't seek cover. Instead, she held up a small, black external drive, her eyes fixed upward on the shadow of Draven Kallor. "Draven!" she called, out her voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "You didn't come here for the Virelli territory. You came because your own board of directors is voting to liquidate your assets at dawn. You're bankrupt, Draven. This raid isn't an expansion, it's a suicide mission to cover your tracks." A heavy silence fell over the foyer. On the balcony, Draven stepped into the light, his face pale and his composure finally slipping. "You're bluffing. Those records are encrypted on a closed circuit." "They were," Elara replied, her gaze never wavering, "until I used the safe room's terminal to bypass your shell company's firewall. This drive contains the ledger of every kickback you've taken from the port authorities. My thumb is on the delete key for your offshore accounts, and my other hand is ready to send this to the Federal Bureau. Withdraw your men, or you won't just be poor, you'll be a ghost." Cassian stood slowly, his weapon still raised, but his eyes fixed on his wife with a mixture of shock and a profound, terrifying new respect. He had spent years trying to guard her from the world, never realizing she had been quietly mastering the weapons that truly moved it. Draven looked at his men, then at the woman standing unarmed in the center of the wreckage, holding the only thing that could destroy him. The power had shifted. The raid was over, not because of a bullet, but because the Mafia boss's wife had decided she was done playing defense. The dust in the foyer settled like gray snow, coating the wreckage of the Virelli legacy. Cassian stood amidst the debris, his weapon lowered, his chest heaving with a frantic exertion that had nothing to do with the physical toll of the raid. The silence that followed Elara's ultimatum to Draven was deafening than the gunfire had been. It was the sound of a world tilting on its axis. Cassian moved toward her, his boots heavy against the shattered marble. He had spent every waking hour of their marriage perfecting the art of the unreadable mask, convinced that any flicker of emotion was a crack in the armor that kept them both alive. He had intended to roar at her, to demand she return to the safety of the steel walls, to exert the control that was his only language. But as he reached her, the shout died in his throat. Up close, he could see the slight tremor in her hands, the smudge of soot on her cheek, and the absolute, unwavering clarity in her eyes. She hadn't just survived the raid, she had mastered it. She had looked into the abyss he had tried to hide her from, and found a way to bridge it. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began. He meant it for it to be a command, a reassertion of his authority. Instead, his voice cracked, the sound jagged and raw, a splintering of the Ice King persona that had defined the Virelli Syndicate for a generation. He didn't grab her arm to lead her away. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed her hair from her face, his touch light, almost reverent. The ironclad discipline that made men fear him evaporated in the heat of a single devastating realization. He hadn't been protecting her, he had been stifling the only person capable of truly standing beside him. "Elara," he began.
"You've chosen your wife over your code," Draven whispered, his eyes gleaming with a cruel triumph. "You've shown the world that you have a heart, Cassian, and a heart is just a target that hasn't been hit yet." Draven turned and disappeared into the darkness of the upper floor before Cassian could even raise his weapon. The trap hadn't been made of steel or gunpowder, it had been built of truth. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Cassian looked down at Elara, the weight of Draven's words sinking in. He had saved her, and she had saved him, but in doing so, they had traded their invincibility for something much more fragile. The war wasn't over, it had simply moved from the streets to the one place Cassian could no longer control. The adrenaline that had sustained Cassian for years as a solitary force now shifted into a shared electric current. Draven's taunt still echoed in the rafters, but the Ice King didn't freeze. Instead of retreating into the cold shell of his old code, he looked at Elara, acknowledging the tactical reality she had brought to light. The ventilation shafts were compromised, and the foyer was a kill zone. For the first time, Cassian didn't point toward an exit. He waited for her to find one. "The service tunnels," Elara said, her voice a low, steady hum beneath the roar of a secondary explosion near the kitchens. "They're built into the original foundation, shielded from the main thermal grid. Draven's men are looking for us on the modern blueprints. They won't see us on the stone." Cassian nodded, a short, sharp gesture of absolute trust. He stepped behind her, his weapon raised to cover their six, his back finding hers in a seamless alignment of purpose. There was no hesitation, no secondary command to stay behind him. They moved as a single unit, a dual command that turned the wreckage of the foyer into a tactical playground. As they reached the heavy oak doors of the servants' passage, a trio of Kallor's mercenaries intercepted them from the shadows of the dining hall. In the old world, Cassian would have shoved Elara to the floor and taken the hit. Tonight, he felt her weight against his spine, her breath steady and synchronized with his. When she dropped low to sweep the lead shooter's legs, Cassian took the opening, firing 2 precise rounds over her shoulder to neutralize the remaining threats. "Left at the pantry," Elara directed, her hand reaching back to catch his belt, guiding him through the blinding smoke of the service wing. "There's a manual release for the sub-basement. It's a dead zone for their scanners." Cassian followed her lead without question, his senses tuned not just to the enemy, but to the rhythm of her movements. He realized then that control hadn't been his strength, it had been his blindfold. By letting go of the need to dictate every step, he had gained a second set of eyes, a sharper intuition, and a partner who navigated the darkness with a clarity he had never possessed. They reached the heavy iron grate of the sub-basement, the cool, damp air of the lower tunnels rising to meet them. Cassian held the perimeter, his eyes scanning the smoke-filled hallway they had just vacated, while Elara worked the ancient mechanical lever.
As the grate swung open, she paused, looking back at him. "I've got the route, Cassian, but I need you to hold the line." He didn't give her a command, he gave her a promise. "I'm right behind you, Elara. Lead the way." The syndicate leader and the woman who had rewritten his rules vanished into the shadows of the foundation, two ghosts moving through a house that no longer recognized its master, but finally understood its queen. The morning light that filtered through the jagged remains of the conservatory windows was cold, grey, and unforgiving. It illuminated a house that was no longer a palace, but a carcass of marble and scorched silk. The sirens had faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy. Cassian stood in the center of the master suite, his charcoal suit ruined, his hands stained with the dust of his own empire. He wasn't looking at the damage, he was watching Elara. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, methodically bandaging a shallow cut on her forearm. She didn't look like a victim who had been rescued, she looked like a soldier who had survived a campaign. The air between them had changed. The suffocating pressure of his control had been replaced by a sharp, clear atmosphere of mutual recognition. Draven Kallor tried to use their connection as a weakness, but in the wreckage of the night, Cassian realized that the only true weakness was the lie of his own invincibility. "The board of directors is meeting at noon," Elara said, her voice steady as she tied off the bandage. "Draven is done. The files I leaked have already triggered a freeze on his primary accounts. He won't be coming back." Cassian walked toward her, his footsteps heavy on the debris. He stopped front of the obsidian panel that controlled the safe room, the wall that had been his ultimate symbol of protection. For a long moment, he looked at the steel threshold, a shadow of the man he used to be, reflecting in the polished surface. Then he did something that would have horrified the Virelli elders. He didn't press the code to reset the system. He picked up a heavy brass fire iron from the hearth and drove it into the delicate electronic heart of the control panel. He struck it again and again, the glass shattering, the wires sparking in a desperate dying hiss until the screen went dark and the hydraulic locks jammed in the open position. He dropped the iron, the clang echoed through the hollowed-out room. The safe room was dead. The cage was gone. "Cassian," Elara stood, her eyes wide as she looked at the ruined machinery. "I spent 5 years trying to make sure you never saw the world I lived in," Cassian rasped, his voice a low, raw confession. He turned to her, his grey eyes no longer like flint, but like smoke. "I don't want a wife who stays in the dark while I bleed in the light." He reached out, taking her hand in his. He didn't pull her toward him, he simply held her, standing as equals in the middle of the ruin. "There are no more locked doors in this house, Elara. From now on, the only rule is that we stand together. If this empire burns, we watch it burn from the same throne." Elara looked at the shattered panel, then back at the man who had finally learned that trust was more powerful than steel. She squeezed his hand, her silence a vow of its own. The raid was over, the estate was a wreck, but for the first time since she had taken his name, the marriage was finally whole. They weren't just survivors, they were partners. And as the sun rose over New York, the Virelli Syndicate finally had a king who was afraid to let his queen lead the way.